What we'll try and do in this session is to look at communication more from a contemporary perspective. Our preoccupation with studies pertaining to mass media was justified because it was the pervasive and dominant media of communication. But however, parallel to the development and spread of mass media, and India is one of the few countries where coexistence of different kinds of media have been a reality. For example, substitution and replacement of media, often talked about in textbooks, is not entirely true with regard to a situation like India, because even now radio, for example, is put forth as a highly sustaining medium of communication as well. So it might be. But what is important is mass media spread and its development has been parallel, more so recently, with what we call as telecommunication based and enabled communication systems and communication media. You have terms like convergence, new media, etc., to describe these changes. But as a discourse, we'll try to broadly look at it as a new media, as a collective new media. Although one understands that there are nuances that we have to understand and appreciate when we are talking about media, when and where a particular medium of communication becomes new or when it is rendered old is a matter of relative perception, I would argue. But new media discourses often talk about new uses of old media. For example, while one medium of communication does not necessarily replace the existing media of communication, the influence of content and approach of successive media of communication will have a bearing on media content across. So we had a situation where probably telecommunications meant a plain old telephone service, which, as all of us know, was confined to an elite and an affordable class of the society. More than the spread, the access to such telephone facilities were limited, and therefore any overlay on the existing telephone system for other media of communication was not perceived at that particular point in time. However, mass media had depended a lot on changes and applications of communication technology. For example, telegraph is a good example of how telegraph generated the notion of instant communication across continents, and you have a lot of practical perception as to the relationship between telegraphy and journalism, the structure of writing, the structure of a news story, all were dependent on the adaptation of the print media to changes in information transmission technologies. You have the facsimile, which allowed for multiple editions of newspapers, and so on. So while telecommunications or telephone lines became the hub and the backbone for mass media content production, distribution, it had not percolated to the level of the masses, so to say. What changed the equation was probably the arrival of cellular technology, what we often call it cell phones. The arrival of cellular technology per se did not change either the usage or the equations, because like all technologies, when they come, not only are they novel, but also they are priced in such a way that certain amount of recovery of the development of that technology also takes place. So, technologies of communication percolate in relation to what is often talked about as the affordability and interest. Now, many countries in the world, particularly the so-called developing countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, always have had the dilemma whenever a new medium of communication has come up, be it radio or television, or even for that matter, newspaper. There is a question of the cost of the receiving apparatus. So, there are certain economic considerations in the spread and intensity of media of any kind. What perhaps happened all over the world was the rising use of cellular technology and the parallel development of mobile telephony made initially voice transmission more widespread, and when convergence enabled data and voice to be merged together, or there was a possibility that you could transfer or convey both textual data as well as voice. The handheld devices combined with internet based and internet enabled provision of content and services all came together in a new dimension to the communication landscape. And without going into too many details, one can easily talk about telecommunication infrastructure, net as a resource, the speed and the accessibility of the net were all important factors in different parts of the world and also in India. But today the reality is that the so-called new media, irrespective of whether we link it to mobile telephony or not, is a combination of devices and platforms on which any and different kinds of content are produced and disseminated. Because the communication ecosystem has become increasingly dependent on these devices, the corresponding uses of the devices have taken the role and function of networking, as some would say. Some would say social networking. So, both functionality, spread and access in a way determined the collective understanding and definition of social media or social media platforms where people could network with each other and share their ideas and thoughts. Now, this is a major deviation from our earlier understanding of mass media, where there is a institutional mechanism for production and distribution of content. Here, the social media platforms have capacities and developed models, revenue models you can call them, where on principles of niche advertising, personalized marketing, etc., they have been able to provide different kind of access to people who ranging from mobile phones to tablets to miniature laptops, etc. So, the spectrum of these kind of technologies is left to the imagination of both the user as well as the market that develops it. So the question that we have to now be concerned with is the limits of social media utility. Now, am I trying to advocate a control mechanism here? No. What I mean is that what was earlier a purely personal medium of communication through such devices, one to one, or probably one to a few, now has become a reality where there can be one to many, there can be many to one, there can be many to many. All kinds of permutations and combinations are possible in this new media ecology. Now, no doubt, any communication technology, like in the past, has always ensured or looked at additional means of spreading knowledge. Scholarship even goes to the extent of saying that communication technologies have democratized knowledge. So there are certain tangible benefits where the Renaissance movement, developments in science and technology, whatever you call it, debatable discourses in modernization, all have a backbone of communication as the basis for spread of information. But along with this is also a concern of, as I said, the rapid spread and the large scale business and economic models that are currently available in practice, where both voice and data are easily transmitted across the world. So, if you want to invoke the McLuhan notion of a global village, I don't think at any point in time the global village reality was as realistic as it's the present situation. Now, while this is very euphoric and enthusiastic, what we need to look at is, are there certain concerns? Are there certain consequences? Across the world, content in the communication and media, particularly content that spreads across different age groups, for example, gender, another example. They've all had issues pertaining to the distinction, for example, should children be consuming adult content? You have concerns about child law, pornography, etc., etc. So, content that way, easily available content, easily accessible content, unless it is layered either by the cultural and many people may not like it, but in such discourses very often, not only in India but elsewhere, the moral fabric is also invoked. I would not get into the intensity of such debates because it will be a different kind of a discussion altogether. But what is crucial is that technology and content have a implication for society at large. Universally, that those concerns are related to, as I said, the mental ability and the physical development of people. But they also have cultural consequences. We often hear that representations, cultural representations, for example, have to be looked at quite seriously because there have been concerns that it can be offensive to portray one culture as demeaning in relation to the other, or to portray a particular kind of living in other situations. So these concerns are at the macro global level. But there are concerns in countries like ours. Go by any definition, country is described and known for certain inherent values. Like, for example, its plurality, its multi-religiosity, and the asymmetry that exists among different classes, and in some discourse there is a discussion on caste, and you have corresponding macro policies that address these issues, which ensures that access to education, access to jobs, etc., is made available on a inclusive basis, as many scholars would describe. So when you apply these principles to communication content in a new media environment, where, for example, the number of mobile phones is almost equal to, or sometimes more, than the population of the country. It may mean many things. It may mean that those who can afford have more than one telephones, and that adds to the calculation. It may also mean that in terms of absolute access, the number of people having mobile phones is significant. And I think the density that is put across by Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India in one of its consultation papers is almost 87 to 90% of the people have access. But this access initially was separated to look at it. Yes, they have voice mobile telephones, but in the present context, data is very important. So they don't have smartphones, which means that multiplicity of users, etc., cannot be ensured. But that argument is increasingly being addressed by the spread of the market and also by technology which is making smartphones at affordable and easy reach. So you have a situation where technically all kinds of content could be distributed. Now you might wonder whether such content is free and easily available. The answer to that question is no. Every service, every utility will work on economic model of business, economic models of revenue. And even widely accessible search engines like Google or any other search engine have embedded models of advertising as a revenue. Now, I am not defending whether it should be the case, but the fact remains that when so many of us access these search engines, we are also kind of, searched very intensively. So much so that you now have search engines which guarantee, for a price of course, that you will not be searched, you will not be indexed, and so on. While this kind of a, what should I say, private browsing, or that I should not be discovered as to what I browse, has been the discourse in terms of internet and its spread across computers. It also is a concern increasingly for the governance system in any country. You may recall that internet governance initiatives was one of the major discourses and policy options, including by multilateral agencies, and there were internet governance models which talked about extending services, registration of land documents. So there has been a silent but parallel use and intensity of internet based and internet enabled data services, which have become more and more acceptable to the people in availing services. So when we talk about an initiative like Digital India, for example, very often Digital India is always confused that, the state wants to reach everybody. Of course, the state would like to reach everybody. But one has to understand that the state would like to reach in terms of the inclusive policies with regard to certain kinds of services, be it financial, for example, or it can be a direct beneficiary transfer. Now, you might say, what is the relationship between this and new media? The relationship is very obvious. New media, unlike in the past, cannot be looked only as journalism or entertainment. That's very important for us as teachers to know. We have to recognize that here is an opportunity to look at communication in terms of other parameters: inclusivity, distress call, emergency, gender justice. You have all these concerns coming together in multiple platforms, multiple users, multiple articulation. For example, if you look at the work of Manuel Castells and the framework of network society, part of that analysis explores the potential of the contemporary network or the networked environment, and he also talks about social movements, and particularly movements that have a different approach to their own development and dissent, for example. Now, this is something that earlier networks were there, but they needed a certain amount of agency function. They needed leadership, they needed advocacy. Not that networks were not there in the past, but the new media environment and possibilities have made networking far more easier. And such easy approaches to networking bring with them a host of other concerns and issues. For example, how does increasingly corporate governance model deal with consequences of corporations in different countries? We have had situations of very popular brands, be it shoes, be it ICTs, all realizing that there are aspects of networking that have address concerns. Now, more than corporate governance, countries like India, which have relatively better traditions of democracy, have to deal with social media and the exercise of what we call as freedom of expression or free speech. Social media and its enlarged access brings the freedom of speech into sharper focus. And this focus can range on a variety of topics, and we have had such large scale movements in incidents, for example, the post Nirbhaya, which led to a legislative framework. We have had in the context of new media, you had a very large social media network space dealing with the whole question of net neutrality, for example. So you have many positive and very cohesive uses of social media, which can be looked at dissent depending on whose side you are representing. While these positive consequences are recognized, society is not homogeneous, you see. It has many layers of people who come to media with different political philosophies, preferences, economic levels of living. So, a country like India cannot advocate or follow or believe in one dictum, social media usage. So there have been instances where, let us say, the security forces are increasingly concerned with spread of rumors, and this has happened, let us say, for example, in a city like Bangalore, where a large scale attack on the northeastern student base, and there was a lot of debate and discussions on that. We have had instances of communally volatile situation where rumors spread faster than facts, and even the mainstream media, willingly or otherwise, has become a victim of such rumors in its reportage on the subsequent day. Casualty figures, who is involved, all these things are kind of dip into the fragile and the volatile composition of our population. Not that some of these variables were not exist. These variables have existed throughout. Call it society, call it civilization. I mean, to say that these differences were not there would be too romantic in a country like India. But the possibility and potential of accentuation of these differences and its articulation has become more acute and visible. Now, this brings to the question, what does an agency do? Or, for example, if you want to ask me a question as to what does the state do in such a situation? You would have noticed statistics, even in the recent years. A country like India has the largest or the highest numbers of internet shutdowns. It occurs in border areas, it occurs in communally such that. Now, see the whole equation of what was touted as a free interactive medium also has become a cause for concern. So, by plugging the pipe which feeds the content, internet shutdown, you want to kind of contain. So, is social media in such situations, after all, social? Is a debatable question. That is it social at all, or as some would think, I would think that sometimes it is divisive. And what has also happened is it social in its manifestation? Sometimes my answer is no, it is not. What has happened is your group formations are territorial. Your group formation and your social media dynamics, your likes, dislikes, etc. on media are determined by your prejudices, your beliefs. So, one would argue that the splintering of the society has become more organized in a social media environment. Now, does it mean that there should be a harsher control? Yes, we have instances. For example, in the context of India, the IT Act as amended of 2000 has many layers of defining different kinds of content, etc., etc. And very recently also the Act has been amended to give more powers to a host of state security agencies. The criticism is that snooping and surveillance mechanisms have been institutionalized, but irrespective of who it is, the governing structure would argue that something that threatens the security cannot be compromised, and they are seeking, what should I say, cooperation. The big, media companies actually today are the social media networks as well. This is one of the reasons why you would have seen CEOs of these social networks, which are really very big, media businesses in the broad sense. They have come and met with ministers and officials. And the primary concern on their part is whether the government is intending to have an access and control the kind of communication that takes place on these social media platforms. Although not expressed very clearly, there have been occasional reports to say that the government in certain specified cases would like to have access to the encrypted form of communication, which at least in the media space, the social media networks have more or less refused, leading to some kind of a feeling among the social media users whose profile is not only intensive but also it spreads across different sections of the society, as I mentioned earlier. So what happens in the kind of communication that I mentioned earlier, both proactive users and sometimes abusers of the usage of social media. There's a general concern, although there is no consensus on the solutions, whether the state, for example, should get into the regulation, to which the state government of India, at least as of July 2018, has clearly indicated in the parliament that they have no intention, and they seem to believe that the IT Act does allow for blockage of content in certain situations that if appropriate would be invoked. But while the privacy argument, while the free exchange of ideas, etc., is the hallmark of discussions and debates in social media, the underlying criticism and concern is with regard to networking of a selective kind. networking of ideological orientation and fringe elements on different sides of ideological beliefs have also been active, are also active in social media platforms. Uh, Essentially, how much of a selectivity and discretion any agency can use in stemming the unintended or the intended use of social media is something that falls in the realm of regulation. And so far, as a response to the issue of net neutrality and also the broad spectrum debates on free speech in India, the government is less inclined. But this inclination or otherwise also has led to situations where the access to net itself is blocked, and once you block that, as I have mentioned earlier also, the social media content and communication automatically crumbles in the sense that you can no longer exchange the kind of ideas and whatever you wish to communicate. And this is something that many governments across the world, depending on how they perceive, have used, which means that the vulnerability of control, irrespective of whether it is by the state or a corporate, or including for that matter the internet service provider itself, has considerable levers of control when it decides to block or facilitate content. The sensitivity to this kind of a facilitation and blocking of content, I think, is a much more debatable discourse in our situation, of which particularly teachers like you and me have to be sensitive in the classroom context, because we are dealing with a demographic profile that is actually born into the digital ecosystem. Scholarship also refers to the notion of digital natives, and the use, the felicity, the multiplicity of languages all make this what should I say, a fascinating medium of communication. And while it is fascinating as a medium of communication, it also has led to apprehensions, and those apprehensions have been addressed. But it's also true in the realm of politics in a country like India. You have had election commission being increasingly concerned about uses and abuses of social media in electioneering. You also had examples of, for example, people talk about the 2014 general election, where one of the variables that seem to have led to the formation of the government by a particular political party has been its efficient use of social media. Now, it also means that the leadership of all political parties, the functionaries of political parties, all have tuned themselves that social media is an option that they would like to use to promote their thoughts, or at least have a following. We have terms like likes and dislikes, you have terms like followers, which means that social media has the potential of a trailing mentality. I would use the term trail, that you want the media to be used in such a way that somebody follows you, and somebody adheres to, or somebody appreciates what you want to say. So, the kind of usage in elections, in many of the elections across the world, wherever elections are practiced in a free and a fair fashion, social media has become an additional or a reinforcing tool of electioneering. Now, this has also led to what we call as the rise of different kinds of agencies which promise a deep profiling kind of a network base, and I'm very sure that the forthcoming election is increasingly going to be fought and discussed not only in the legacy media like the press, radio, television and cinema, but also in the social media. For example, our Prime Minister at a given point in time was regarded as having the one of the largest followers in terms of the people who wanted to follow him. So you have and film stars rate their popularity in terms of the quantum of followers that they have, the tweets that their fans follow. But what has also happened, which is a cause of concern, is the instant response, what I would call as a keyboard triggered response, can be leading to, or can lead to a flashpoint situation. Not that societies, as I said earlier too, were not in conflict. So conflict and conflict resolution have been the hallmark of many societies. But controversies around postings on social media, and thereby the tendency to express can be rampant, which is what the social media promises, but it can also be instinctive and thereby have the danger of not being many a time well thought of reaction. So the consequences might be an immediate reaction, immediate provocation, a like and a dislike, and it fades out of the memory, which means that constantly new issues, new concerns have to be in circulation. I'm not decrying such a phenomenon, but that is what differentiates the better rooted mass media, which have verifiable recorded content which can be dealt with in the laws, either civil or at times criminal. But that kind of a what should I say, framework of either laws or defense to both users and consumers is not yet crystallized. So you have what we call as mob following or mob frenzy, as it happened in the case of let us say some movies and sports events. Now all this have to be looked at when you are looking at the new media. What is new about the new media is the immense networking potential and the kind of what should I say, spontaneous formulation of ideas and opinions. So I would say that while in democracies free speech probably is enhanced through social networking, there is also a danger that larger economic interests might capture the discourse on social media. It has happened with marketing companies, it has happened with retail companies, and this is something that as users we should be guarded against. So where does it leave a teacher like you? Is media education about content? Is media education about sensible restraint? Is media education about responsibility? Is media education about sensitive to the other person? Where does my freedom end and where does the other person's freedom begin? These discourses are there for all of us to see, but I think purely from a point of view of refreshing your approach, I think you will have to balance and separate what were the concerns in legacy media, because they are institutions which are regulated by a set of economic laws, by a set of ethics. Social media yet is to fall into that charted territory, and that is where you see the people using it and you know the kind of effects it has. So maybe one of the trends in journalism education or trends in media education can be an approach where departments, education institutions can go beyond the students and incorporate the community, be it neighborhood community or focus groups or civil society groups, so that their use and approach to social media is what I would say is either better or maximizes the potential of the advantages it has. Thank you.